Hello. Today I'm going to talk about a set of studies investigating how we communicate through movement. Obviously, we can move our bodies to accomplish many different goals. Sometimes we move them to accomplish instrumental goals by manipulating objects in the physical environment. Other times we move to pursue epistemic goals by moving to accrue knowledge. And sometimes we move to fulfill a communicative goal. But what's really interesting and unique about communicative goals in particular is that they always rely on another person. Because in order to accomplish a communicative goal, your intended recipient must understand that your movements are meant to communicate. Whereas if you're trying to turn on a light or find out what's inside of a box, the success of your actions doesn't depend on whether a person watching you will understand what you're doing or not. But in the case of a communicative goal, it is absolutely necessary that your intended recipient recognizes your goal in order for you to succeed. One way that you can make sure that your intended recipient recognizes your communicative goal is to use a conventional gesture. If you and your intended recipient know the same conventional gestures, then you can capitalize on this common ground. But is it all convention? Is that the only way we can recognize and communicate through movement? Well, of course not. Convention can't be the only solution for a couple of reasons. First, when young children learn these gestures, they're not conventional to the learner, so there must be more flexible mechanisms supporting communication through movement. Second, we as communicators can create new gestures pretty flexibly. I'm sure you can think of a time in which you had to, for whatever reason, improvise a gesture and you were able to do so. Moreover, several studies confirm that people can create and understand novel communicative movements, even in the absence of convention and ostensive cues, and in these very limited grid-like environments. So how do we do it? How, in the absence of convention and ostensive cues, do we communicate through movement? One answer could be that our intended recipients might just be really good at recognizing communicative goals. And indeed, these studies show that observers are good at inferring communicative goals for unfamiliar movements. So this could be one way to think about what processes underpin gesture creation. It could be that in the absence of convention, gestures choose arbitrary movements, and the inferential burden falls on observers, such that the observers do the bulk of the work to infer when we're trying to communicate. And I'm broadly going to refer to this as our non-mentalistic hypothesis for gesture creation, because the gesture, when they're creating new communicative movement, they're not thinking about the perspective of the observer. But instead, I want to propose that gesture creation is actually a social inference problem for the communicator. So I'm going to call this our social inference hypothesis, which proposes that gestures are motivated to make sure that their gestures are successful, and will choose movements based off of what goals the observer could infer. So to make this a bit more concrete, imagine that you're an agent and you want to communicate with someone through movement, but you have no gestural common ground and no conventional gestures. So how do you even begin to choose how to gesture? Well, according to our social inference hypothesis, you'd want to think about what an observer might infer in order to avoid confusing your intended recipient. So if our gesture considered making this movement to gesture, then she'd realize that doing this would be a bad idea because extending her hand upwards could be an attempt at communication, or an attempt at touching the tree above her head. So there's a chance that her observers could infer the wrong goal, so doing something else would be better, for example, moving her hand away from the tree. Therefore, under the social inference hypothesis, communicators should choose their gesturing movements based on which goals their observers are likely to infer. This also implies that communicators should create different gestures when non-communicative goals in the environment change. As I said before, this is a bad gesture in this environment because it could be confused with the goal of touching the tree. However, in an environment like this, it's actually perfectly fine. And this is just a simple example to give an intuition as to how, in the absence of convention, the space of non-communicative goals in the environment will change the types of movements that make good gestures. So to recap, we propose that gesture creation is a social inference problem, and communicators act to ease observers' inferential burden. Therefore, communicators should shape their communicative movements based on which goals their observers are likely to infer. Which means that communicators should create different gestures when non-communicative goals in the environment change. And as a preview for the rest of the talk, I'm going to begin by reviewing a simple computational model that we built to derive the sorts of movement strategies that people should use if gesture creation does involve this sort of recursive social inference. Then I'm going to talk about two behavioral experiments that test this social inference hypothesis. So to show you how our model works, I'm going to walk you through a simple toy example. Here in this world, there's a robot who is our agent, and in the top square up here, there's a panel of buttons. And let's suppose, for the sake of simplicity, that there's only 4 possible movements that you can make. So that means if you're the agent and your goal is to get to the buttons, then you obviously want to move up. You want to take this yellow path because none of the other 3 movements will get you to that goal. Now instead, if you're the agent and you want to communicate, but you're not doing any work to make sure that your observer understands you, then you can choose any of these movements if your goal is communicative. And we're calling this our non-mentalistic agent because this agent is behaving according to our non-mentalistic hypothesis. Now we're going to switch gears and think about this from the perspective of an observer who sees one of these movements and has to infer the agent's goal. So let's say they see movement 1. They'll likely infer an instrumental goal, but could also infer a communicative goal. Notice that this means the observer is going to have an asymmetry, where movements 2, 3, and 4 are obviously communicative, but movement 1 could be inferred to be communicative or instrumental. However, if we have an agent who is aware of how the observer makes its inferences, then the agent could take this into account and prefer to communicate through movements that are not confounded with the instrumental goal. So the important thing to take away here is that if you're a communicator and you're taking into account the inferences of your observer, then in this environment, you should communicate either through movements that travel away from the other goals or are repetitive. But critically, the agent should prefer different strategies if the other goals in the environment change. So to explore the effects of this goal configuration aspect, we modify the environment so that now both directions lead towards instrumental goals. So there's now a button panel up here and down here. So now moving straight in either direction is consistent with an instrumental goal. So even though our non-mentalistic agent will still use any of the 4 movements to communicate, both movements 1 and 2 will be confusing for the observer because they can either be used to communicate or to reach the buttons, whereas movements 3 and 4 are obviously communicative. Therefore, our social inference agent will prefer to use these repetitive movements when communicating. If anyone is interested in the model details, you can feel free to ask me later, but many of you may have realized that this structure is the very common structure of recursive social inference, has been used in other models of social reasoning, such as the Rational Speech Act model. And taken together, simulations using this computational framework reveal how our account predicts changes in gesturing strategies based on the spatial layout of non-communicative goals in the environment. We then tested these qualitative predictions in 2 experiments. In experiment 1, we wanted to look at whether the spatial distribution of non-communicative goals leads people to gesture in regions that are unconfounded with those other goals. So here's the basic task. We had online participants use their mouse to move this robot's arm around the screen to push these green buttons in the top half as they lit up one at a time. But sometimes they'd get an alert in their headphones, and that alert meant that they had to signal an observer who could see the robot's arm movement as it was moving around the screen, and that observer was trying to figure out when the participant was signaling to them. But to show you what I mean by this, here's a quick video of someone actually playing the game. So the mouse is just following the participant's, the arm is just following the participant's mouse as it's moving around the screen, and they're hitting the buttons, and in a second the outside of the screen is going to turn red. And that's just a signal to you as the audience of this talk that that's when the alert would have happened for the participants. So that's when they should have begun to signal their partner. If participants are shaping their communicative movements to lead the observer to the correct inference, then when an alert happens, we predict that they should choose to signal in the bottom half of the screen, since that's unconfounded with the other possible goals in the environment. So to analyze participants' signaling behaviors, we compared their behavior during non-alert intervals, when there was no alert playing, so they should just be moving to push buttons, to behavior during alert intervals, when there was an alert playing, so they should be moving to signal to their partner. And specifically, we looked at how much time participants spent in the bottom half of the screen, comparing between non-alert intervals and alert intervals, with our prediction being that participants should spend significantly more time in the bottom half of the screen when they're signaling to their partner. And this is exactly the pattern of results that we see, where participants are spending time in the bottom half of the screen to communicate with their partner. And this is what it looks like. This is kind of a representative example of what the signaling looked like in practice. So the participant is moving to hit buttons, and then they get an alert. They move to the bottom half of the screen, and then when the alert is over, they move to continue pushing buttons. So experiment 1 provides evidence that people are sensitive to the spatial distribution of other goals that an observer could infer. And this is consistent with our social inference hypothesis. So in experiment 1, participants chose to signal where there were no goals. In experiment 2, we remove this strategy such that areas throughout the screen are now confounded with instrumental goals. So according to our social inference hypothesis, people should differentiate the manner of their movement when communicating, since there's no spatial solution available. Specifically, we predict that participants should use repetitive movements to create novel communicative gestures. So the overall setup of experiment 2 is exactly the same as experiment 1. Participants are still moving to hit the buttons as they light up one by one, but now there's just buttons throughout the entirety of the screen. And then alerts happen in the same way over the participants' headphones, and then they now have to signal to their partner. And again, we're comparing behavior between non-alert intervals and alert intervals, so when participants are hitting buttons and when they should be communicating with their partner. And specifically, what we're looking for here is we're looking at the number of repetitions that participants produce, so the number of times they retrace their trajectory while they're playing the game. And our prediction is that participants should be using these repetitions to signal, so they should be producing significantly more repetitive movements during the alert intervals. And this is exactly the pattern of results that we see. Participants on average produce about 11 repetitions when they're communicating with their partner. And again, here's an example. So for this participant, the alert just happened, and you can see that they retrace their movement vertically up and down in large repetitive movements. So the results of our empirical studies suggest that during gesturing interactions, communicators spontaneously consider the likely goal inferences of observers when deciding how to move to communicate. And this leads to the creation of gestures that are distinct from non-communicative movements. So I just showed you that when people create gestures, they're motivated to reduce the inferential burden on observers. But you might be wondering, does this actually shape what gestures look like in the real world? This is a teaser for a related project. We're actually looking into this. We're looking at what conventional gestures look like around the world and whether they conform to these predictions. And as a quick preview, over 97% of gestures in a database of over 300 gestures actually conform to the predictions of our framework, suggesting that this individual propensity to signal through movements that are distinct from other goals that we see in these little robot empirical studies that I presented here, they may become amplified and entrenched in conventional gestures cross-culturally. So overall, when viewed as a social inference problem, gesture is an exciting example of how we as social agents not only make inferences about the goals of other agents, but also how we use our inferential abilities to shape our own actions to broadcast our goals to observers. Lastly, I want to thank my amazing advisors and collaborators on this project, both at Yale and the University of Edinburgh, and thank you all for listening.